The number 666 is widely recognized as the number of the beast due to a specific passage found in the book of Revelation, which mentions that he who has the ability to understand must calculate the number of the beast. However, it's important to point out that there are ancient manuscripts of the Bible that present a variation on this same point in the text, because instead of mentioning the number 666, they refer to the number 616. This discrepancy in the numbers raises interesting questions about translations and interpretations throughout history. And, to our surprise, this situation actually helps to simplify matters, rather than making them even more complicated and difficult to understand. This is because the presence of this variant offers a valuable new clue that gives us the opportunity to unravel the identity of the individual behind this enigmatic number of the beast, doesn't it? The vast majority of historians currently hold the belief that the enigma surrounding this question has already been almost completely elucidated in the content presented in this video. We will therefore proceed to analyze this variant in detail and also try to understand this concept of associating names with numbers, a practice that was quite common in antiquity. We will also present here who is considered the main suspect, who was possibly the person the author of the Book of Revelation had in mind when making his references. So let's start a discussion about the numbers 666 and 616. To begin to understand this narrative, it is essential that everyone pays attention to the variants of these numbers, which are 666 and 616. These two numerical expressions are found in various ancient manuscripts that have been preserved over time. It's interesting to note how these different representations appear in varying historical and cultural contexts, effectively highlighting the relevance of these numbers in different traditions. The number 666 can be found recorded on an ancient papyrus dating from the 3rd century, which is labeled P47. This archaeological piece is of great historical relevance, as it represents one of the oldest evidences of the use of this number in a written context. Its presence is also recorded in the writings of the theologian Irenaeus of Lyon, who lived during the 2nd century of our era. Yes, that's true. The content related to Hippolytus of Rome, who lived in the 3rd century, appears in his texts, which have a significant presence in 2 codices. There are 2 volumes that stand out and are extremely relevant for research and in-depth study of ancient manuscripts of the Bible: the Alexandrian Codex, dating from the 4th century, and the Sinaitic Codex, which also belongs to the same historical period, i.e. the 4th century. It's interesting to note that the number 666 can be identified in all these texts. However, when we analyze other manuscripts, we come across the occurrence of a different number, which is in contrast to the one mentioned above. As I mentioned earlier, another significant codex dating from the 5th century, which refers to the rewrite of the Ephraim Codex, shows the number 616 instead of the usual 666. In addition, there is a relatively recent discovery, which took place over the last few decades, which concerns Papyrus 115. This also bears the number 616 and is dated between the years 225 and 275, which places it approximately in the middle of the 3rd century. Therefore, it can be said that this papyrus is, in fact, one of the oldest testimonies we have of the texts that make up the New Testament. In the image shown, we can see P15, which has the letters iota and stigma, thus forming the number 616. From this point on, we'll begin to discuss a little more about the connection between numbers and letters. However, before we get into this topic, it's worth pointing out that in the past, during the period of Irenaeus of Lyon, around the 2nd century after Christ, which is very close to the appearance of the first documents about Christianity that we're discussing, there were already individuals who knew the 2 options mentioned. The numbers 666 and 616 are numerical representations that have different contexts. The number 666, for example, is often associated with a variety of cultural and religious interpretations, appearing as a symbol that can evoke both fears and myths, and is known in the Christian tradition as the number of the beast. On the other hand, the 616 is also a number that has its own representation and, in some academic discussions, this number is considered a variant of the 666 in ancient texts, generating debates about its importance. Both numbers, therefore, transcend their purely mathematical function and connect to wider meanings in society. Irenaeus of Lyon, a notable figure in early Christianity, is known for his criticism of the 616 variant, choosing instead 666 as the preferred interpretation of the famous number attributed to the beast. In this context, it is important to mention that there were also some authors from the Donatist strand, which represented a specific group of Christians established in North Africa. These authors interpreted the number of the beast from the perspective of the 616 variant, thus showing a strong preference for this interpretation over the more common 666, which was also known to them. This discussion on the interpretation of the number of the beast reveals the different ways in which each of these characters understood and approached this symbol, highlighting the divergences and nuances that emerged in the analyses and beliefs of that time. It's very important to take a moment to analyze this subject, and the first point we need to address is the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the letters of the alphabet not only represent sounds, but are also associated with numerical values in the writing of the Greek language and in several other languages that belong to the period of antiquity. This relationship between letters and numbers gives us a richer and deeper understanding of the culture and language of these ancient civilizations. Therefore, when we talk about numerical representation in languages such as Hebrew or Greek, especially in the context of the New Testament, it's important to note that today we don't use the same numbering system, such as the numerals we know, which include symbols such as 1, 2, or 3. Instead, in this ancient tradition, the letters of the alphabet had a numerical function, and each letter or combination of letters could symbolize a certain number. For example, in the manuscript known as P515, which I mentioned earlier, the letter iota, combined with the letter stigma, represents the corresponding numerical values. The iota equals 10, while the letter stigma corresponds to the number 6. By adding these values together, we arrive at a total of 616. Furthermore, the number 616 is presented explicitly in Greek, as it is in this papyrus. On the other hand, when we analyze the case of the number 666, as it appears in papyrus P47, we find the combination kappa, which represents 20, the letter 11, xi, which has a value of 60, followed by the letter stigma, which, once again, is worth 6. So, by adding up these values, we again get that they make up the writing of the number 666, and it's fascinating to note this, because when we mention it in this way, we can see that we have the same cipher repeated 3 times, can't we? First there's a number 6, then there's another number 6, and finally there's another number 6. With regard to manuscripts that are considered ancient, we can say that this situation does not occur. When we find a version that uses an abbreviated form made up of letters, we see the presence of 3 different letters, which appear one after the other. On the other hand, when we analyze the same word written out in full, we notice that it breaks down into 3 different words, which correspond to the numbers 600, 60, and 6, don't they? In this way, it's not just a number sequence of 36, and it's essential to understand this issue, since when we think about the combination 666, it becomes relatively simple to transform one of the numbers into a single one and present this situation as a mistake made by a copyist. The argument would be that the person only changed one number. However, this interpretation does not apply to the case in question, because when we look at this record in its entirety, it is clear that the copyist was fully aware of what he was transcribing. In the scenario where he decides to replace the letter iot with the letter 11, which by the way are characters that differ significantly from each other, it seems that there is a reason that goes beyond a mere one-off error. This confusion doesn't seem to be simply the result of a diversion of attention that can occur during the process of transcribing a manuscript, but indicates a greater complexity that deserves to be analyzed carefully. It wasn't just a simple variant that would have arisen as a result of a mistake made by a copyist during the transcription of a manuscript, resulting in this current format. However, this is not a significant problem. Quite rightly, taking up the discussion about the fact that the letters of the alphabet have numerical equivalents raises a fascinating concept. Within this context, there is a method of interpreting and assigning meanings to texts, particularly those considered sacred, which is known as gematria. This practice of gematria focuses on the relationship between letters and numbers, offering a new perspective and depth in analyzing such texts, allowing interpretations and connections to be discovered that are often not evident at first glance. The Jews used this expression. The ancient Greeks used the concept known as isopsephia, which refers to the same technique mentioned above. This technique consisted of a particular way of interpreting a text, taking into account the numerical value assigned to each letter. Thus, the Greeks sought to uncover secrets or hidden meanings that might underlie the text, using these numerical correspondences. Letters that, when manipulated, make it possible to perform sums and numerical calculations, were quite common among Jewish and Greek communities. This is a phenomenon that we can observe by analyzing various examples that offer us rich material for study. That's why I'm going to share some of these cases, because they're really fascinating. One of them is a graphite engraving that was found on a stone in the ancient city of Smyrna. This inscription dates back to the 2nd century of the Christian era, specifically around 200 AD. In it, we can find a message that resembles a kind of graphite, the basic interpretation of which reveals that, when performing a calculation, we have the following expression: equal to when calculated Lord 800 and faith 800. This indicates that the author of the inscription was demonstrating that the words Lord and faith in Greek have the same numerical value, which is a very interesting curiosity. They have the same value or meaning. If you add up the letters, you'll get a total of 800 in both situations. This statement highlights the connection that exists between the terms Lord and faith, revealing how these two words are interconnected in their meaning and applications. It's quite likely that there was an inscription there, perhaps graffiti, isn't it? A piece of urban art with a Christian theme. In the city of Smyrna, we can observe the presence of various graffiti, which are forms of artistic expression on murals and urban walls. These graffiti stand out and contribute to the city's visual landscape, reflecting the local culture and ideas. I also had the opportunity to discover some inscriptions with similar messages in the ancient city of Pompeii. However, the texts I'm going to present below, which originate from the city of Smyrna, have very interesting content. One of them expresses the statement, "I love the one whose name is 731, while another mentions, "I love the one whose name is 13,308. These messages reveal a fascinating aspect of relationships and expressions of affection found in historical contexts. Surely it's clear that these people don't have numerical designations, right? If you add up the number corresponding to each letter in the name of this specific figure, you'll arrive at a very interesting numerical quantity. In fact, a historian made a remarkable discovery in relation to the year 1308, identifying the name Tiku, which was quite common in that locality and is therefore very likely to have been the name of a loved one who created this graffiti. Furthermore, this name also appears outside the context of this graffiti. In more widely circulated texts, such as manuscripts, we can find references, as in the case of the Sibylline Oracle, which is a document that combines Jewish and Christian elements and dates back to the 16th century. There is a passage in this text that mentions the incarnate Son of God, alluding to Jesus. It is clear that, in this context, this text also contains the number 888, which is the sum of the values of the letters that make up the name Jesus in Greek. On the other hand, there is also a non-Christian reference that circulated in the form of manuscripts, related to an author known as Suetonius, a Romanian active in the 1st-2nd century, who reported that Nero's opponents proclaimed a new reckoning in the streets during the period when Nero was ruling, thus mentioning the so-called Reckoning of Nero. The sum of the cards bearing Nero's name corresponded exactly to the same sum attributed to the cards that also refer to Nero. This infamous man murdered his own mother, an act for which he became widely known and despised in Roman society at the time. It's important to pay attention to the figure of Emperor Nero, as he will be a crucial character who will keep reappearing throughout this text. But before we go any further with this analysis, let's focus specifically on the calculations that were made by ancient authors regarding the numbers 616 and 666. We will thus try to interpret the meaning of this text from the Book of Revelation within the context of the reflections presented by the Donatist authors. As I mentioned earlier, there is a significant calculation that states the following. When we consider the word Antichrists, we see that the sum of the letters that make it up results in 154. When we multiply this number by the number of letters in the name Nero, which is 4, we arrive at a total of 616. So 154 multiplied by 4 results in 616, correct? Furthermore, we find another interpretation in a Donatist text that also belongs to the same historical period. In this text, 616, which is mentioned in the Book of Revelation as the number of a man, could be a reference to Jesus himself, identified as the Son of Man, whose title is Christus. It should be noted that the first, last, and middle letters of the word Christus in Greek are represented by the letters K, iota, and sigma. Thus, we suggest that he would appear deceptively in the place of Jesus, supporting the idea that the number associated with the Antichrist would reflect an imitation of Christ's appearance. However, there is an important aspect to consider in this analysis. In fact, the number 616, which is the last digit mentioned, together with the bar symbol, does not actually represent the letter sigma, but rather the stigma, a sign that has different characteristics to sigma and also has a numerical value that is also different. At the end of the day, when they set about interpreting this number, be it 666 or 616, it's fair to say that they were doing what was asked of them, isn't it? What did the original author of the Book of Revelation expect? I was doing some calculations and came across an author who, in my opinion, manages to summarize quite accurately the way this exercise was conducted. The author, who shares his ideas in a work entitled 3 Steps, deserves to be mentioned here, as he is a historian who has expressed the following considerations. Initially, readers need to identify the characteristics of an individual within a broader context. Then they must reflect on the name of a person who could fit these characteristics, and finally, It is essential that they check whether it is possible to associate this name with the number proposed in the activity. Initially, it is important to note that there is a vast and unlimited universe of options available. However, from this extensive range, there is a restriction based on the specific circumstances of the context in question. Then, within this narrower scenario, a few names are chosen that can be considered as possible alternatives. After this selection, in the third step of the process, calculations are made to determine whether or not the chosen options harmonize adequately. It is also interesting to reflect on what message he intended to convey, and, for this, it is relevant to consider what historical references could have influenced this choice of the numbers 666 or 616, which have meanings loaded with symbolism in various contexts. And in fact, when we talk about how contemporary historians carry out this exercise appropriately when investigating a possible candidate within a specific historical context, the first step that will be taken is to assess the environment in which both the author of the work and its initial readers were inserted. Isn't that right? Historically, it is widely recognized that an author, when producing a text, does so on the basis of a body of knowledge and experience that he or she possesses. In addition, this author is addressing a specific audience that already has a sufficient level of understanding to grasp and interpret the message being conveyed. So, when we define the context in which we seek to understand the identity of the numbers 666 or 616, it's essential to consider the context in which the author inserted these references, isn't it? Therefore, we must bear in mind the circumstances and environment that molded the author's thinking for more precise analysis. It's not effective to try to look for historical figures such as Napoleon, or religious figures such as Pope Francis, as well as looking for technologies such as chips that are implanted in people, or even people like Elon Musk, since none of this was inserted into the context of either the author or the readers who had access to the original text, correct? Therefore, analyzing from a historical perspective, it is essential, according to historical methodology, that we delve into the author's context in order to understand what message he intended to convey. Within this specific context of the author, one aspect of great relevance is that he was situated in the period of the Roman Empire and, quite possibly, was alluding to a Roman emperor. This reference manifests itself through a variety of clues that appear throughout the narrative of the Book of Revelation, right? Initially, the Book of Revelation makes use of various quotations and references that are taken from the Book of Daniel in order to convey its messages. These messages are built on these reference elements that have already been previously discussed and shared by other people who are also familiar with the content of the aforementioned Book of Daniel, right? The Book of Daniel, found in the Bible, mentions various beasts that appear in its prophecies. These creatures are often interpreted as symbols of kingdoms or powers that will exert influence throughout history. For example, in chapter 7, 4 beasts are described that represent different empires. These visions are rich in symbolism and have been the subject of intense study and analysis. In addition, the images of these beasts convey profound messages about the struggle between good and evil and the ultimate fate of human kingdoms under divine sovereignty. It is a recurring theme both in the historical context and in the theological interpretations that continue to this day. In the case of the 4 beasts mentioned, they have a direct reference to various kingdoms, which leads to the conclusion that the beast portrayed in Revelation can equally symbolize a kingdom or perhaps a king, and can even be interpreted from a perspective in which the king represents the kingdom, or vice versa, where the kingdom can be seen as a representation of the king. This reasoning places us in a context that involves questions of political power. Furthermore, it is important to emphasize that the beast described in the Book of Revelation has diadems on its head, which is also worth considering in this analysis. The diadem can essentially be described as a kind of crown that symbolizes, in addition to its aesthetics, a position of political authority. Furthermore, it is worth noting that this decorative object is also associated with terms considered blasphemous, which are represented on the heads of the beast. The diadem therefore carries complex and intriguing meanings in different contexts. The names that could be considered blasphemous, in relation to the context of the empire under the leadership of the emperors, could be those titles that were conferred on these rulers and which, in the perception of the Jews and Christians of the time, presented characteristics of disrespect or offense to their faith. In other words, it was the epithets or denominations attributed to these emperors that could be seen as blasphemous, given the religious understanding in which they found themselves, correct? During the period when the Roman Empire was at its fullest, emperors were often referred to as divine beings or designated as sons of God, which gave them an aura of sacredness and almost absolute power. This way of referring to emperors not only reflected the belief in their superiority, but was also part of a cultural and religious context of the time, where the connection between divinity and the political leader was common. Therefore, the use of such epithets as divine or sons of God could be seen by some as expressions of blasphemy, since they implied a level of veneration that rivaled the cult of God, thus challenging the line that separated divinity from humanity. Furthermore, the narrative contained in the Book of Revelation clearly and directly mentions that the beast has power over a variety of nations, implying an allusion to the vast Roman Empire, which stood out for its immensity and scope, dominating practically the entire portion of the world that was recognized at the time. That is, the world that was within the reach of the author who wrote this text. The passage from the Book of Revelation mentions a battle taking place against the saints, which is initiated by this beast. It is therefore quite plausible to consider that this passage also refers to the persecution that was often carried out by the Roman Empire against Christians in that historical period. This connection suggests that the events described in the text not only have a symbolic meaning, but also correlate with the reality of the oppression faced by the faithful at that time. At least some of the emperors there adopted this attitude of hostility towards the Christianity that was emerging at that time. In the Book of Revelation, we find a notable mention of the beast that exercises control over commercial activities, and the heads of this beast have an explicit association with the seven mountains. This association is a very direct reference to the city of Rome, which, historically, was built on these seven mountains, known as the iconic Seven Hills of Rome. In addition, it is essential to point out that the beast demands a public cult and the adoption of acts of worship, characteristics that were clearly reflected in the behavior of the Roman emperors. Many of them, during their lifetimes, were the object of worship, being deified, and promoted the active participation of the people in their ceremonies of worship and reverence. So it's not essential that we acquire all this evidence, but there is a strong argument in favor of the accumulation of various elements present in the Book of Revelation. These elements, in fact, repeatedly allude to the idea that the author of the Book of Revelation is referring specifically to Rome, the Roman Empire, and the Roman Emperor. This connection is significant when we analyze the historical and cultural context of the work. And within this broader context, we still have the possibility of investigating something that is even more detailed and specific, which refers to identifying which emperor, in fact, is the reference mentioned, if there is a particular emperor to whom he is referring, isn't it? There are significant indications to support this idea, as an allusion is made to the creature called the beast, which is fatally wounded, yet still manages to survive. This subject is closely related to Nero and, as we will analyze below, there is also a mention of the beast that sets Rome on fire, as well as another possible allusion to Nero. But then the fundamental question arises, doesn't it? Having made this delimitation that gives us a clearer context, we can now consider a possible candidate name, that being the name of Nero, and then move on to the third stage of the deciphering method that has been established. At this point in the process, the aim is to check whether or not the name Nero aligns with the numbers that are often associated with it, which are 666 or 616. In this way, we will be looking for correspondence or contradiction between the name in question and these numbers mentioned. To determine whether or not the number corresponds to what we are looking for, we can say that the answer is yes, it does. For this to happen, we must follow a specific procedure. Firstly, we have to transliterate the name Nero Caesar from Latin into Hebrew and then add up the numerical values of the letters in that language. In this sense, in the Hebrew alphabet, we find two letters that are represented by the sound num and have a value of 50 each, i.e. they add up to 100. There are also two letters pronounced resks, each of which has a value of 200, which adds up to 400. In addition to these, there is a letter called vov, which represents the number 6. Another element we consider is the letter kof, which equals 100. Finally, we have the letter psamek, which appears 4 times, worth 100 in each of its instances, except for the last one which has a value of 60. This detailed sum of the letters allows us to continue checking the numerical correspondence. By adding up all these elements, we arrive at the number 666. It's important to emphasize that, since this is a video focused on a specific subject, the information marked originally is actually located at the beginning of the video. In this context, the main focus is on the variant that corresponds to the number 616. In addition, there is the possibility of transforming letters of Latin origin into Hebrew letters, which could result in the generation of the number 666. On the other hand, if we start analyzing the Latin name Neron, which is a longer version of the name we find in various historical texts, we also arrive at the number 666. However, if we consider the abbreviated form Nero, which in turn also appears in various texts dating from that period, we should note that in this specific case, the numerical value in Hebrew would be reduced by 1 unit. This is because, in this form, the n represents the number 50. So, when we take this into account, we arrive at a total of 600 added to 16, resulting in the number 616. In this way, the two forms of writing we have for Nero Caesar, as recorded in Latin, have been transliterated into Hebrew, where one of them results in the number 666 and the other corresponds to the number 616. Emperor Nero is a character from history who generates many discussions and questions. However, it is essential that we bear in mind some relevant objections that need to be analyzed carefully. One of these objections, which may have already arisen in your mind, concerns the fact that Nero had died by the time the Book of Revelation was written. So the question that arises is, why, then, was a mention of Nero made in this context? However, before we get to that question, it's important that we explore two other rather intriguing objections that also deserve our consideration, don't they? The predominant language at the time was Greek, so much so that both the New Testament and the Book of Revelation were written in this language. So it may seem a little peculiar that an author who is writing his works in Greek should use the name of the Latin language in his texts. This situation can cause a certain amount of strangeness, since the reference to Latin, which was a different language, arises in the context of a communication that takes place predominantly in Greek. The Latin term that refers to the Hebrew language is Hebraica. This name is used to identify the Semitic language that was spoken by the ancient Hebrews, as well as being the language of the sacred texts of Judaism, such as the Torah. Therefore, Hebrew is the correct Latin name for this language rich in history and tradition. This is indeed quite peculiar and surprising, as well as being something that can be considered out of the ordinary. Therefore, the appropriate answer to this situation must undoubtedly be no. There are historical examples that support the possibility of this phenomenon occurring in similar circumstances, where Jewish communities lived in local environments that were dominated by Greek speakers. In these contexts, it is observed that these Jewish communities used to adapt and transliterate names from Latin into Hebrew, reflecting a common practice of linguistic and cultural adaptation in situations where a predominant language influences the way individuals express themselves, especially in relation to nominal identifications. This demonstrates a significant pattern and can therefore be considered a valid precedent for this discussion. A good example that can be mentioned in this context is the presence of a synagogue situated in the ancient city of Sardis, which is located in the Asia Minor region. In it, we can observe the presence of the name Severus, which is a name of Latin origin, but which has been transliterated into the Hebrew form. It is important to emphasize that this area of Sardis, located in Asia Minor, was predominantly Greek, which makes this linguistic phenomenon even more interesting and significant. It's reasonable to think that the interpreter who, in the past, dedicated himself to analyzing the Book of Revelation could eventually reach the solution to this enigma, right? It wouldn't be totally impossible. I understand that you would like to confirm that something is right, correct? This method in question would not be so exaggerated as to make it impossible to reach the number itself. In fact, although it is a way that could lead to it, it is essential to point out that there is a second objection that also relates to the question of the transliteration of the word Caesar. When we look at the transliteration of this Latin Roman name into Hebrew, which appears in the Talmud, a compendium of texts considered extremely relevant from the Jewish rabbinical period, we notice that an extra iodine is added compared to the way we are using to arrive at the calculations that result in the numbers 616 and 666. Therefore, if we adopted this specific way of transliterating the name Caesar from Latin into Hebrew, the count would include an additional iodine, which would lead us to a final sum of 626 or 6706. It's important to emphasize that the yod represents the value of 10. However, this objection, in turn, can also be easily circumvented, since we find several pieces of evidence from older texts, including the Talmud itself, which mention the word Caesar without the presence of the yod, thus validating the form of transliteration we are using in this context. Thus, in the well-known Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, we can observe the presence of the word Caesar, which appears without the letter yod, inside a synagogue located in Dura Europos. In addition, it is possible to observe that the word Caesar appears without the letter iod, and there is even a promissory note that was discovered in the Judean desert, which has a form identical to Nero Caesar in Hebrew. This correspondence results in the number 666, correct? Therefore, considering the absence of this additional number, and taking into account the letter N at the end of the name Nero, we can conclude that there are several contemporary historical documents that are closer to the text of the Book of Revelation than the Talmud itself. These documents present the expression Nero Caesar in Hebrew, thus enabling the calculation that results in the numbers 666 or 616. So we've reached the point where we're going to address the third objection, which refers to the fact that Nero, the Roman emperor, had already died before the time the Book of Revelation was recorded, correct? In fact, we can say that Nero really is in charge, can't we? He reigned there until the time of his death, which occurred in the year 68 of the Christian era, and it is highly probable that the Book of Revelation was written there. We can't say with complete precision, but it's very likely that the document was written at some point between the 80s and 100s of the Common Era, approximately the period following the birth of Christ. In any case, the situation we are considering would have occurred after Nero's period. So we can look for a clear and precise way to elucidate this question, can't we? If we interpret Revelation as a work that refers to a future in which a creature, commonly called a beast, will arise, this is a fairly common view of the message contained in the text. This beast is often associated with events and changes that will occur in the times to come, as described in the prophecies of this scripture. The idea is that this being will represent negative or adverse aspects that humanity will face in a time yet to come, according to the beliefs and teachings present in this work. This would need to occur immediately after their action or decision. If the person in question is writing a text about another person who preceded their own existence, this situation is not logical or coherent. In fact, this statement has a logic that can be considered coherent and understandable. The initial way to understand this question, based on the historical documentation that is relevant to our understanding of this specific period, is to take into account a belief, which can be interpreted as a legend in a way, which refers to the figure of Nero. This historical figure is seen as a being who manifests himself in different ways and carries different interpretations. Nero's story is presented from different perspectives, the first of which indicates that although he was mortally wounded in 68 AD, he didn't die immediately and instead hid in the region of Asia Minor. In this remote location, he was preparing for an eventual return to power, a narrative that can be found in the works of authors such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and other ancient historians. It's worth noting that these authors, despite not believing in the veracity of this version, recorded the popular belief that circulated widely at the time. There is another version of this legend that refers to Nero as Living Red Nero, which arose later. Contrary to the belief that he had survived and would return, this new narrative held that Nero had indeed died, but would somehow resurface and exercise his power over the earth once again. This idea can be found in the writings of authors such as Commodius and Sulpicius Severus. So, in some way, the repetition of Nero's way of ruling could symbolize his return, either in the literal sense, as a resurrection of the figure of Nero, or in the broader sense, representing a principle or a form of government. The idea that Nero was alive at the time the apocalypse was written is an idea that deserves to be highlighted, because if we are analyzing this work from a historical perspective, it is essential to take into account the environment in which the author produced the text, as well as the context in which the readers of this writing found themselves, ready to absorb its messages. If this idea of a living Nero really did circulate, one possibility to consider is that the apocalypse somehow aligned itself with this belief about Nero's survival. Or, on the other hand, it may have used the figure of the Roman emperor not just literally, but as a representative symbol. According to an author I quoted in a previous video, this could be compared to the use of Hitler to represent the concept of absolute evil, or the figure of Napoleon as a manifestation of the desire for greatness and power. This idea of symbolism is a way of understanding how historical characters can be used to convey broader messages in literature. Therefore, we can observe the presence of certain individuals, historical figures who actually lived in a previous period and who, with the passage of time, have acquired a significance that transcends their individual existences. These people have become emblems, representing concepts or ideals that are much broader than their own lives and circumstances, haven't they? In this way, it's possible that the author of the Book of Revelation intended to bring up the figure of Nero or, perhaps, a concept associated with him. This implies, in a way, considering the significance that Nero had for Christians during his lifetime, with the aim of establishing a connection that would suggest the possibility of similar events being repeated in the future. This repetition could occur either through the manifestation of a specific individual who embodied Nero's spirit, or in a continuous way where, at different times and in the presence of different people, the role he played will be played again. What is currently observed is that there is a fairly generalized consensus among historians, that is, a common understanding that spreads among them, that both the number 666 and the number 616 allude to the figure of Nero. Thus, it can be said that these manuscript variants, although they present superficial differences in their presentation, in essence convey the same message and meaning. So it's safe to say that, regardless of these differences in form, the central message contained in these texts is identical, isn't it? If you're interested in deepening your knowledge on the subject of the imagination in relation to the Antichrist and the figure of Nero, known as the Living Red, I'll provide a link to a series of videos I've put together on my channel, where I discuss notions of the Antichrist over different centuries. In addition, I will include an older video, which was one of the first pieces of content I produced, in which I deal specifically with the figure of Living Red Nero. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to see you again next time.